My name is Jennifer. I'm one of the pastors on staff here, and it's a joy to be with you on Mother's Day. And because it is Mother's Day, I'm going to show you yet another picture of my family because you haven't seen enough before. So just in case you don't know their names yet, this is Titus. He's 16. He's a sophomore at Silverton High School. Josiah is 18. He'll be graduating this year and has been looking at colleges. That's a whole nother journey we'll talk about a little bit later. Skip the guy in the middle for a second, and then you've got Abigail, stand on the rock. Abigail's 12. She goes to a tiny little school out in the Silverton area called Prattam. If you've never heard of it, all the better, because we'd love to keep it tiny. But if you have little kids and you're looking for a great school, you might check into it. These are my kids. Some of my greatest joys just come from being present with these people who are so fun and developing their personality, and even playing cards around the table can be some of my greatest moments of joy. Some of my greatest challenges are represented right here on the screen in front of you as I learn what it is to parent and to walk with kids who are growing up and becoming their own people. And then I will tell you about the guy in the middle. His name is Jeff. He's my husband. We've been married for about 20 years, 21 this August. And my mom used to say, Jennifer, God knew exactly what you needed in a husband, and he gave you exactly who you needed. And she's so right. I can't imagine anybody else who could walk with all that is me through this life that is our life. So this is my family. I love them. One little story as we get started. Years and years ago, the one on the far left, who's my least favorite, Titus, he said, he was probably 3 or 4, so we'll give him some grace. And I had done something for him. I think maybe I'd made him a piece of toast. And as I handed it to him, I said, thanks, you're the best mom in the world. As in, repeat that back to me. Thanks, you're the best mom in the world. And he said, well, thanks, but that's not you. It's Aunt Tiffany. Tiffany is pretty great, and she makes a mean piece of toast. But he and I have since made amends. It's okay. It's all right. As we were talking about Mother's Day and what this day was going to look like, I was reminded of when I was a kid and I walked into the church on Mother's Day. Because when I walked into the church on Mother's Day, the moms were greeted with a flower at the door and a smile, and everybody had their children in their Sunday best. And we would come into the service, and at some point the pastor would have all the moms stand, and we would honor them. And there's something so right and so good about that. And yet, as we've gone through the years, we've noticed, and rightly so, that Mother's Day is hugely painful for a lot of women. And as a church, we've realized we need to be sensitive and mindful of those for whom this is a day that is a reminder of losses, is a reminder of unfulfilled hopes and dreams. And so we've taken a step back from the way that we used to do everything. And yet in taking that step back, I think we've also missed it a little bit, because there are years when we really do nothing at all. Maybe a little video at the start that says, Happy Mother's Day. And there's this tension, isn't there, of how do we do life in a community our size when everybody who walks through this door has a different interaction with what we call Mother's Day. And so that's actually what we're going to dive into today. And just in case you're concerned, like one of my coworkers was, with why did they make Jennifer preach on Mother's Day? How rude. I'm actually thrilled to be here today because I feel uniquely able to speak to some of the women's issues that rise up on a day like today, even those that I've been walking for the last 8 years as the women's ministry pastor here. So I'm really excited to be here with you this morning and to really dive into the reality of doing life together as a body of Christ when it's not easy. So as we were talking about all this, I was looking into the history of Mother's Day, and it was fascinating, especially in light of the fact that we've just been talking about justice for the last couple weeks, because the foundations of Mother's Day were based on what could be seen as justice issues. There was a woman named Anne Reeves Jarvis in the late 1800s who gave birth to 10 children and only 4 lived. And as an activist, she put that to use, and she started a club called the Mother's Day Work Clubs to teach mothers how to care for their children. They talked about things like hygiene and general health practices and sanitation and nutrition. And then in the late 1800s, when the Civil War broke out, that club changed its focus to caring for wounded soldiers on both sides of the war. They said, we're mothers. We don't care which side you fought for. We want you to be healed and whole and well. And then as the war ended, the club changed its focus once again to reconciliation. They started what they called Mother's Friendship Day, where they brought people together from both sides of the conflict to try to promote reconciliation and unity in this broken nation. These are the roots of Mother's Day. They're rooted in both grief and joy. Anne's daughter was the one who petitioned President Woodrow Wilson in 1914, who, when it finally became a national holiday on the second Sunday in May. And yet, so often, as a whole, we remember the joy of Mother's Day, and we kind of step back, and we don't mean to, but it's hard to acknowledge the grief of Mother's Day at the same time. As we were talking about that, I'm sitting in preaching team right now. You know that when I sit there, I'm in a room with Steve Fowler, Brian Condello, and Rob Basham. And one of them said, Jennifer, this is really about learning to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, right? Learning to put ourselves in their shoes. And they said, we're men. We don't necessarily know how to put ourselves in women's shoes. So Jennifer, on Mother's Day, would you help us see how to put ourselves in our wives' shoes? So here you go. This is how you put yourself in your wife's shoes. I actually think he's already doing a pretty good job of it, right? All joking aside, here are my 2 tips for men married to women. I think the whole message will apply to all of us, but here's 2. When we look at joy and we look at grief, guys, you don't need to be reasonable in the face of exuberant joy. You don't need to convince her to look at reason or to not get her hopes up too high. You can just be present with her in exuberant joy. And guys, you don't need to solve anything in deep grief. In the face of grief, there's nothing that you need to fix. I'm going to say it again later in the sermon, but grief is not a problem. Grief is a feeling. It doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to be held. Those are my tips. If you want to know how to walk in a woman's shoes, let her feel her emotions and express all of them. I'll give you guys a bonus tip because you're 9:30. There are times when I've had a really emotional unleashing of whatever it might be. And then I will realize what time of the month it is. And I will say to my husband, I'm sorry, this is probably all blown out of proportion. It's not a big deal at all, the blubbery mess. And he has said something that has been one of the biggest gifts in my life, and it is this. Jennifer, you may be more emotional than you usually are, but I love it when you talk to me like this because I see seeds of truth that are deeper than what you usually let me into. Because when I'm able to be capable and competent and control it all, I manage myself, right? But in those times when I can't manage my emotion, it all comes spilling out. He says, Jennifer, that's actually a gift that you give me because you've just let me see something deeper than what you let me see on a normal day. So when your wife is losing it, guys, whether with joy or grief, would you look for the seed of truth that you don't always see because her guard is down and you're actually seeing deeper into your heart, into her heart than you get to see on a regular basis when she's just keeping it all together? When we walk through these doors on a day like today, you have to know that in a place this size with as many people who are sitting here right now, there are so many relational and experiential variables going on in people's hearts. That on a day like Mother's Day, there are some who are walking in who really get that this is a day about honoring their mom. And they've had a mom who did a great job at teaching them and growing them and being present with them. And they celebrate motherhood in their life because they've had this great example of a mom. And there are others who have that great example of a mom who don't have that mom with them anymore, whether it's through medical failing or actual death. Can I just say that yesterday I went to the cemetery and I laid flowers on my mother-in-law's grave and my mom's grave, and I don't have a living mom on this earth anymore. And I'm not the only one. And yet, I showed you the pictures of my kids. There's amazing joy this day. I walk in also this day as a mom of 3 kids who are doing well and who are developmentally appropriately doing what they're supposed to be doing, even if it means that he's going away to college. Friends, I did great on the college visit, and I was all business with the advisor and the FAFSA, and these are the classes, and there's the chapel, and then we walked into the dorm, the dumb dorm. And he's walking up the stairs in front of me, and I'm trying to keep my tears from rolling down my cheeks as I go, he's not going to live with me next year. What is wrong with this world? From the moment he was conceived, it was my job to protect, and I don't get to do that anymore. And in these changing seasons, there's this variety of emotions. There are those who walk in who would love to be moms, and they've not yet been able to do that. Whether that's because they're single and not able to have children, or they're married and not able to have children. And I need to say this really clearly. I know that there are those of you watching live stream because it was too painful to walk through these doors today. And I just want to say that I get it. And I know and I understand. And we want to be a place where we can rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. There are those who've had children who have walked away from God or walked away from the family, and there is estrangement that is so painful every day, knowing that there is a piece of your heart walking around in this world who is no longer connected to you. There are those of you who've lost children through death. There are those of you who've lost parents. There are so many scenarios. There are those of you who have been looking to adopt, and the process has taken years and years and years. There are those of you who had children and it looked one way, and when they were born, you found that they had amazing special needs. And now your life every day is a life where you grieve the challenges that are theirs every day, and you grieve the loss of your own expectations, and you wrestle with guilt at grieving the loss of your expectations in the face of their amazing challenges, because these are people who you love, who you would give your life for, who you are giving your life for. And yet there's grief every day. Mental illness robs us of our relational wholeness at times. Friends, when we walk through these doors, there is such an array of joy and grief. There are those who've just found out that they were pregnant, and there are those who have just found out that they miscarried. We cannot walk into this day with our rosy faces and say Happy Mother's Day without acknowledging that we come from such different places. And it's not just, it's compounded and it's complicated, because think of this. We tend to think of the journey of childbirth and whether or not you have a family as established in these childbearing years. And so if there's this journey of infertility, it happens during these ages. But do you know that these griefs that we grieve are not just the grief of the baby who would have been born, but it's the grief of the family that would have grown. And there are some for whom walking into this sanctuary is so hard, because they sit behind a pew of people who walk in and fill the whole pew with their kids and their kids' spouses and their grandkids. And even now, 20, 30, 40 years later, they have to say, God, that was what I had hoped for. And yet we cannot take away from the joy and the delight of the grandparents who just got to walk in on Mother's Day and fill the pew with their kids and their kids' spouses and their grandkids. And what a joyous thing to be able to be in church together. How do we make the uncomfortable comfortable? When we come into a room of community, when there is such a disparity of experiences, how do we make the uncomfortable comfortable and learn to walk with each other in this way? We see a key, which is where we're going to go in the scripture today, in Romans chapter 12 and verse 15. If you want to follow along for a little bit, it's on page 944 in the Bible that's in your pew there, Romans chapter 12. And we're going to put this one up on the screen. It's just a short one, and start here in verse 15. It says this: Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. If you're reading it here in the Bible, it says, be happy with those who are happy, and weep with those who weep. It's so short and so simple, and yet so profound. Why is it profound? Because it's completely countercultural. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world. And then what Paul does is he goes on and he writes out ways that we see what the world does and we do it different. Customs that we see, and we choose to start new customs. So we drop to verse 3 and it says, don't think you are better than you really are. Totally countercultural. How many advertisements have you heard lately that say, don't think you're better than you actually are? Look at verses 6 through 8. It's all talking about the gifts that God gives us, the things that he created in us to give to the world, not to further our own kingdom, not to become more wealthy, not for financial gain or corporate success, but because it blesses the community around us. And he says, enter into these things you were created to do, that I created you to do, to bless the people around you. How different would that vocational look be than the one that is ours, which is, hey, what job could get you the most money? What would be the most successful? What would be the most prestigious? What if we looked at who God created us to be? Verse 10, love each other with genuine affection and take delight in honoring each other. It is countercultural to take delight in honoring other people. Never be lazy, but work hard. Be patient in trouble. Always be ready to help people in need. Here's a hard one. Bless those who persecute you. Don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them. Friends, these things are completely countercultural in today's America, and it's in this line of things that we find our little sentence that says, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Why does it matter that it's countercultural? Because we have to understand that we don't see this modeled in the world around us, and it doesn't come natural to us. And unless we pay attention and notice and work at it, we're going to miss it. Because it is so easy to simply avoid people who don't feel the same way as us. It's like magnets that repel, and it's just so easy to gather as like with like and hang out. Happy people hang out with happy people, and sad people hang out with sad people. I heard someone say it like this one time. It's kind of like people say, hey, you sad people, go on over there and just talk amongst yourselves and don't let any of your grief get on us. And yet it's equally hard sometimes to be with people who are super hopeful or super joyful or super excited about something when we're wrestling with the own brokenness in our own lives. And it's not just about Mother's Day and parenthood. Job loss, failed exams or failed tests, or the job you didn't get, or the school you didn't get into, or the really messy breakup, or the really difficult marriage, or the divorce. I didn't mention earlier, some of you here are moms who are single and you never expected it to look this way. It's not just Mother's Day when we need to consider how do we rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. And I want to suggest that one of the first steps is recognizing that these two emotions exist within ourselves. Because some of us are not good at giving ourselves permission to have both joy and grief residing in us in the same place and in the same time. As an example, I've walked with women who have suffered a miscarriage and then a couple months, 3 months later had a healthy pregnancy. Is that joy or grief? So when you get to the due date of that first child and you are pregnant with a healthy child, are you happy because of the child that you're expecting? Are you rejoicing in that? That's great. And are you feeling guilty because of how happy you are? Because of the loss? And if you get to that day and you're feeling that loss and your grief is rising up and that is healthy and that is whole and that is good, are you feeling guilty about feeling grief while you have a healthy pregnancy? Or let's put it this way, when you put it in community, do we find that we compare with others' grief and others' joy, and we say to ourselves, well, you shouldn't feel that bad because at least you have, and you fill in the blank. Or you shouldn't feel this happy because someone else is hurting. Friends, neither of those engage in the reality that God is the creator of our joy and the comforter in our grief. And when we are living in both those things, we can live in wholeness and health and healing in the midst of feeling both those things together. My joy does not dishonor or devalue my grief, and my grief does not dishonor or devalue my joy. And if we can't do that inside ourselves, then it's very difficult to walk into a place like this or our families or our extended community and be people who can walk that out in our culture and community if we can't allow ourselves the freedom to feel both things at the same time, because they are both there. They are both there. So how do we do this? The first thing that we do is we engage and we embrace. Friends, we need to engage with each other in these places and not avoid these places. How do we make the uncomfortable comfortable? By learning to engage and pushing past our discomfort and being present with people however they are feeling. When I don't mourn well, when I know someone who is suffering and I don't engage in that feeling with them and I don't sit present with them in that mourning, I become calloused and a problem solver. I begin to see their grief as something to fix because, quite frankly, when someone we love is sad, we feel sad. And none of us like to feel sad or to feel that discomfort or to feel that everything's not right. So what do? We try to fix the person in grief so that I don't feel bad. But if I can engage in that grief with them, if I can go heart to heart with them and I can truly mourn with them, I am less likely to become a problem solver. Because as I mentioned earlier, grief is not a problem. It is a feeling. It is something that rises up and pours down our face in the form of tears that tells us that something is going on and that our soul is alive and that we need to pay attention. And the people who love us need to pay attention because it's a part of who we are. We cannot run away from those who are in grief because we are uncomfortable with their sadness. Grief doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to be held. And on the flip side, when I don't rejoice well, when I'm in a valley of my own life and I can't see past what's going on for me to see the goodness of God at work in someone else, I allow my hurt or even envy to turn into bitterness and resentment. And that bitterness and resentment leads to isolation. Friends, we need to check our hearts for envy. And I want to say this as gently as I possibly can because I get that the pain that we bear is so very real. But there is a difference between grief and envy. Grief, this sense that I have lost and I am grieving the loss of dreams and I am grieving the waiting that is so painful and hard. That is important and we need to engage in it. But when it turns to, I am upset with you because you have what I want. I am jealous of you because you have what I long for. I'm going to avoid you because being with you hurts too bad. We need to check our heart for envy because envy is the enemy's tool to drive us to bitterness and resentment and isolation. And the way to hope and freedom is to engage together no matter how hard it is, to stay together with the joy and the grief. One of the practical ways that we can do this is by practicing gratitude. And again, I know that this might be a hard word today because you're like, Jennifer, there is nothing to be grateful for right now. And I would say, please, for all that is good and holy, find one thing that you could say, that is good. God, I will give you thanks for that. Because gratitude does not invalidate our grief. We can be grieving and grateful at the same time. And gratitude is the precursor to joy. And so we engage and we embrace in both the joy and the grief because that is the way that we love each other. So how does that start? It starts when each of us as individuals will share without shame. We will share what's going on in our world so that we can know and be known. If we truly believe that we are created for relationship, that we were made as God is to be in community, then we know that a goal of life is to know others and to be known by others. And the only way to be known by others is to let our voice be heard. And yet how many of us have felt shaming when we have been super joyful and somebody has said, whoa, girl, turn it down. Like, bring down the volume on that joy. You're just a little bit, you're over emoting for me right now. You're a little too much. And we learn that we kind of have to regulate how much joy we show people. And in turn, we regulate how much joy we allow to rise up in our heart. But on the flip side, how many of us have been told, whether verbally or with nonverbal cues, your grief is too much for me. I can't handle being around you when you're emoting this much. So when you can kind of get your sadness in a place where it's comfortable for me, then I'll come back around. And so we also learn to back off from our grief and we say things like, oh yeah, it's been hard, but I'm okay. Oh yeah, it's a loss, but God is good. And we temper our grief. Friends, we need to be willing to share our joy unapologetically and share our grief unapologetically. A few years ago, there were a couple women who were good friends and had been walking the journey of life together, and both of them had been struggling with infertility for a time that had just really been weighing on their hearts. And there came the day when the one who became pregnant needed to share without shame with her friend that she was expecting a child. And the example of one who rejoices with those who rejoice, when that friend with complete and uninhibited exuberance said, I am so happy for you. I am so grateful for you. Does that take away from her own grief and longing and waiting? No. But it enters into the wholeness of rejoicing with those who rejoice and mourning with those who mourn. When we will share without shame the reality of what's going on in our world, we give others the opportunity to know us and then in turn to be known by us. I have a friend who's walked this incredibly well. Her name is Sarah. Some of you might remember her. She's, before she was married, her name was Sarah Zollner. She worked here at Salem Alliance for several years, and she later moved to Portland and got married and had 2 beautiful kids. And several years ago, she and her husband lost their son, Otis, in a sudden, unexpected turn of events. And they have since had another baby. This last week would have been Otis's 5th birthday. And Sarah walks this without shame with a bunch of her friends on the vehicle of Facebook. And she has posted truly hard days and truly great days. They have started a hashtag called For the Love of Otis that is this doing random acts of kindness and posting about what you've done to be kind to people. She especially talks about that a lot in the weeks that lead up to Mother's Day because that's the week of his birthday as well. And she has been such an amazing example of sharing without shame because she's not ashamed that we know it, but she's also not ashamed that she feels it. I talked with her this week about several things, and I asked her permission to share this. She posted the night before Otis's birthday this week. And she said, I had really hoped that tonight would create some space to sit in the yard and have some peaceful time to reflect on Otis's life, but that did not happen. In this home with other kids and other things, it was just a crazy night of bedtimes and toddler. And she said, I just found myself trying to just keep breathing in and out. As it turns out, sometimes just breathing in and out is enough for one day. I'll try again tomorrow. And as she shares without shame that her reality is sometimes just breathing in and out is enough for one day, there are those of us who read that post and went, that is exactly how I felt today. Just breathing in and out was all I could handle. And she affirms and sees and invites out the realness in me and the hope that, guess what? We all get to try again tomorrow. The fact that it didn't work out tonight, we all get to try again tomorrow. And so we share without shame because when we share our stories, we're a piece of the healing journey for each other. And when someone shares with us, we listen without judging. We listen without judging, because if we are not the ones walking through the valley of the shadow of death in the grief that someone else is walking in, then we are not grief-stricken ourselves. We are grief-adjacent. And we need to recognize that when we are grief-adjacent, there are no seats in the spectator section for telling somebody else how to walk their journey. How long it's supposed to take, what it's supposed to look like, how many tears it is, how few tears it is, none of that. We don't get to judge someone else's journey. We lead with questions. Rather than telling them how they're supposed to feel, we say, how do you feel? How is this going? What do you need? One of the best pieces of parenting advice I ever got was to just be honest with my kids and say something along the lines of, you know what? I have never been the parent of a freshman before. What do you need from me? Rather than trying to figure out what he needs from me and do that thing, to lead with questions and to listen without judging. James 1:19 says this, you must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. I think this is a huge key in this journey of rejoicing with those who rejoice and mourning with those who mourn, when we will set up that the first thing I want to do is listen. And I'm not listening so that I can figure out what I'm going to say back. I'm listening to hear your heart. I'm listening to be part of your healing journey, because truly listening is love. And then when I've heard, I'm slow to speak. I weigh my words carefully. I guard my heart. Sometimes nothing needs to be said at all. And I'm especially slow to become angry, because, friends, oftentimes our anger and offense comes because we expect the other person to know what we're thinking or what we're feeling without being told. And I have a little secret to tell you. There is only one person in the world who knows what's going on in your head and in your heart, and that's you. And the people in your world cannot be held responsible for knowing how you feel and what you think if you haven't told them. They are not mind readers. And if you're getting offended with people because they can't see how you feel by your nonverbals, then that's quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And finally, we acknowledge without assumption. Friends, we've got to acknowledge sometimes the elephant in the room, that you and I are in 2 different places. My kids are going to college and they're competing in choir competitions where they win state. That was Silverton a few weeks ago. And your kids have turned away from God and have left home, and it's not looking the way that you thought. And you walk in and you sit behind me in church and you think she has got it all together and her kids are the all-American kids. And I would just say, We have got to acknowledge the differences without assuming that we know how that person feels or what they think or what they're saying. One of the things I think we could really practice that's practical here is not putting words in other people's mouth. So when we know someone's going through something difficult or really great, we tend to say, oh, you must feel so, and fill in the blank. You must feel so devastated. You must feel so happy. You must be so proud. Can I suggest that we lead with questions there too and say, I noticed this on Facebook. How do you feel about it? I've really been thinking about you lately. How are you feeling? Give people the opportunity to tell us rather than assuming that we know how they're doing. And friends, if in doubt, choose to be present. Part of acknowledging this is to be present with people that we love. Sarah mentioned to me, she said, Jennifer, the people who said the, quote, wrong things during that season right when Otis died, the people who said the wrong things didn't hurt me as badly as the people who said nothing at all. Try it. It might be bumbling. It might be awkward. You might not know what to say. You might not know how to do this, but choose to move through the uncomfortable to the place where it can be comfortable, not because we're doing it perfectly, but because we are choosing to be present. Ephesians 4:2 says this, always be humble and gentle. Be patient with each other, making allowance for each other's faults because of your love. When we will walk with each other in humility, not making assumptions that we know what they need, in gentleness, not coming with harshness or directives or you should be this, that, or the other thing. When we model the love of God poured out in both rejoicing and grief, we are showing the nature and character of God to a world that desperately needs to know that joy and grief can coexist in community and in individuals. Because you know the classic verse, it says, love is patient, love is kind. It is not jealous and it does not boast. Friends, in our joy, let us not be boastful. In our grief, let us not be jealous. But let us walk with gratitude of where we see God at work and truly learn to rejoice and celebrate and grieve and comfort and mourn. Let's pray. Father, I'm just so starkly aware that you know the ins and out of every heart in this room, of every mind in this room, of every heart and mind that's watching this service on live stream right now. That you know what synapses have erupted as a result of this conversation or just as a result of this day. And I just declare that you are the God of all comfort. You are the Redeemer of all brokenness. You are the peace that passes understanding. You are the presence that empowers us to carry on and put one foot in front of the other and just keep going, to breathe in and out. And you are also the creator of joy. You are the gift giver, the good gift giver. You are the delight and the light of our eyes. And you are the one who rejoices with us when we see the giftedness of your presence here on this earth. And you know what it is when we are in relationship with each other, when those two seem to be at tension. Would you empower us, Holy Spirit, to walk those together rather than magnets repelled by each other, but to be magnets attracted to each other, that we might be part of the wholeness and the holiness that is you and the reflection of you in this world. It's in your name that we pray.